The night of February 18, 1944 began like countless other winter nights over Europe, cold, moonlit and restless. But just before midnight, something unusual stirred at RAF Whiten. Ground crews stepped back as a line of twin-engined Mosquito-sleek wooden, almost silent at idler rolled toward the runway. Their mission? A high-speed strike into the heart of Berlin. Pilots exchanged quick glances. They had done this before. But tonight, their aircraft felt different, a little sharper, a little angrier. The sort of edge you notice only if you've flown the same machine 100 times. At 2300 hours, the Mosquitoes launched on after another lifting into the black sky like ghosts. Seconds later, German radar stations along the coast detected them, but almost too late. Controllers barked orders. Searchlights spun. Fighter units were scrambled. A staffel of Bf 109 seconds clawed upward, engines roaring, trying to close, but something was off. The Mosquitoes weren't just fast, they were pulling away. Climbing, diving, turning, accelerating in ways the Luftwaffe hadn't seen before. Reports flooded in, claiming unusually high speed. Outruns interception. Inside the German command bunker, officers whispered theories. Some suspected a new prototype. Others thought radar errors. But a handful of analysts had heard a different rumor. The British were secretly overboosting their engines. A mechanic name, unknown identity Berry had, found a way to make the Rolls-Royce Merlin deliver far more power than the manuals allowed. A trick so simple, it was practically invisible, and technically illegal. Tonight, above the frozen forests and burning cities of Europe, that hidden modification was changing the outcome of a mission. German fighters strained to catch up, engines screaming, but the Mosquitoes slipped beyond reaches if propelled by something no one had authorized. But the truth behind that power boost didn't begin in a cockpit nor at a command briefing. It began with one mechanic working late in a dimly lit hangar, studying an engine he believed could give more if only someone dared break the rules. The story began years earlier, long before anyone whispered about forbidden engine tricks or mysterious speed gains. In 1940, Britain was reeling from the fall of France and bracing for invasion. Aircraft factories were stretched to the breaking point, and aluminum was becoming dangerously scarce. That was when an idea surfaced, an idea so unconventional that many senior RAF officers dismissed it outright. A bomber made of wood, not steel, not aluminum, wood spruce, birch and balsa. The proposal came from Geoffrey de Havilland, who insisted a wooden airframe could be lighter, faster and easier to build in furniture workshops across the country. Wood would also free up precious metals for Spitfires, Hurricanes and heavy bombers. But every traditionalist in the RAF shouted the same complaint. A wooden bomber? It will fall apart. Pilots called it the timber terror. Engineers predicted the wings would flex apart during high-speed dives. Critics demanded armor turrets and heavy defensive guns. But de Havilland resisted. He wanted the opposite. No guns. No armor. Just speed. By 1941, the first Mosquito prototype proved them all wrong. Its smooth wooden skin created far less drag than metal aircraft. It accelerated hard, climbed fast, and handled like a fighter. The secret wasn't just the airframe, it was the beating heart at the center of it. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The same engines powering Spitfires and Lancasters, but tuned very conservatively on Mosquitoes. Manuals strictly limited how much boost mechanics could allow, how hot the engines could run, and how much stress they could endure. Violating those rules meant court-martial engine failure or worse. Yet every mechanic on every airfield knew the truth. The Merlin had power to spare. Ground crews whispered about how far they could push it before the pistons scorched, or the supercharger tore itself apart. Some insisted the engine could handle far more boost than the official limit. Others dismissed the idea as foolish bravado. But there was one mechanic, quiet, stubborn and annoyingly perceptive, who didn't see the Mosquito as a fragile wooden experiment. He saw it as a machine with untapped fury inside it. And unlike the officers who doubted de Havilland, he wasn't afraid to test the boundaries, because he had seen engines pushed far beyond their limits long before the war began. He wasn't famous, no medals, no heroic portraits, just another RAF ground fitter whose name appeared only in maintenance logs and reprimand sheets, but everyone on his station knew him. Before the war, he had been an automotive engineer of those rare minds who didn't just repair engines but understood them. He knew how metal expanded under heat, how fuel behaved under pressure, how a supercharger breathed when pushed to the edge. He had tuned racing engines that screamed on pre-war British tracks before the government banned such events. He had spent late nights adjusting carburetors, shaving tolerances, coaxing more horsepower out of machines that were never meant for such punishment. To him, the Merlin wasn't a sacred artifact of Rolls-Royce engineering. It was a challenge. He respected the manuals, but he didn't worship them. Where others saw limits, he saw choices. And where the RAF saw danger, he saw a question that had been bothering him since the first day he worked on a Mosquito. Why are these engines running so mild? As he replaced spark plugs or checked supercharger seals, he kept noticing the same thing. The Merlins were built with tighter tolerances and stronger components than their paperwork admitted. These engines, he believed, were being forced to run like sedans when they were capable of running like race cars. But officially, the RAF couldn't take risks. Mosquitoes flew deep into enemy territory on long missions. Their engines had to survive hours at high altitude. Command insisted on reliability over everything. Pushing the Merlin too far could mean a piston seizure at 25,000 feet or a catastrophic failure with no hope of bailout. Still, the mechanic couldn't shake the suspicion that the limits were conservative, very conservative. And then he started noticing something else. Pilots returning from dangerous missions always asked the same question. Is there anything more you can get out of her? They weren't asking for miracles. They were asking for moments, 30 seconds of extra climb, a minute of extra speed during a chase, a little more bite when diving away from an enemy fighter. Speed meant life, and he hated saying no. Inside the hangar late at night, he'd stare at the boost controls, the manifold pressure gauge lines, and the supercharger linkage. He knew there was one particular point in the system where everything came together. One small mechanical interface that dictated the absolute maximum allowable power. If he could adjust that even slightly, the Merlin might give more. Enough to change a chase, enough to alter a mission, enough to outrun a fighter. But making that modification was forbidden, not discouraged, illegal. And yet the idea refused to leave his mind. He didn't stumble onto it by luck. It came from obsession, the kind of quiet, relentless thinking that follows a mechanic home long after the tools are put away. Every Merlin he worked on gave him new clues. Every inspection reinforced the same truth. The engine could handle more than the RAF allowed. The key was the supercharger boost control linkage. In the Merlin boost, pressure, the force of air pushed into the cylinders, was everything. More boost meant more power. More power meant more speed. But the RAF had set a strict mechanical governor on how much boost a Mosquito's Merlins could reach. The linkage physically limited the throttle and supercharger from going beyond a specific point. It was a hard limit, unbreakable unless someone altered it. One night in late 1943, long after the pilots had gone to bed, he stood alone next to a Mosquito with the cowling removed. The hangar was silent, except for the faint echo of distant generators. Under the inspection light, he studied the linkage measuring rods, pivot arms, stops, lock nuts, a tiny assembly that dictated an entire aircraft's performance. And then he saw it. A tolerancing gap. Small, almost trivial, but enough. If he adjusted the pushrod length by just a hair, half a turn maybe, less, the linkage would allow the throttle and supercharger to open further. The gauges would show higher boost. The engine would drink more air, burn more fuel, and unleash power the manuals never acknowledged. It wouldn't leave obvious evidence. It wouldn't require cutting or bending anything. It would take 2 minutes. But if anyone found out, he'd be facing charges for unauthorized modification and endangering aircrew. He hesitated for a long moment. Then he reached for his spanner. The adjustment was delicate. A quarter turn too far could overstress the supercharger. Too little, and no pilot would notice. When he finished, he tightened the lock nut, stepped back, and exhaled. It looked identical to the regulation setting, yet it wasn't. He reassembled the cowling and rolled the Mosquito outside for a night engine run. Under the moonlight, he climbed into the cockpit, set the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin didn't roar, it exploded with life. The boost gauge needle shot higher than he'd ever seen on a Mosquito. The vibration deepened. The exhaust flames sharpened in color. He held the throttle there only seconds, terrified of blowing a head gasket, but the engine held. Smooth, strong, hungry. The mechanic leaned back, heart pounding. He had done it. He had found a way to give the Mosquito more power than any regulation allowed. Pilots would later describe the tuned Merlin as feeling alive, as if it wanted to leap forward. They started whispering to each other. Ask him for the special tuning. He can make your Mossy run like it's angry. Just don't tell the brass. And soon, whether he liked it or not, the illegal boost spread through the squadron. The first true test came before dawn, on a frigid morning in late 1943, when a Mosquito assigned to a reconnaissance run over the Ruhr taxied out with engines that sounded just a little too eager. The pilotone of the few who knew about the mechanic's adjustment felt the difference the moment he opened the throttle for takeoff. The aircraft surged forward with a force he wasn't expecting. Mosquitoes were already fast, but this felt different. The acceleration pushed him deeper into the seat. The climb rate sharpened. The controls responded as if the wings had shed weight overnight. He didn't radio anything. He didn't need to. The grin on his face said enough. Crossing the Dutch coastline, he spotted what every Mosquito pilot dreaded. A formation of Bf 109G models climbing aggressively vectored by radar to intercept him. These were the upgraded interceptors, faster, more powerful, designed to finally catch the elusive wooden bomber. Normally, a Mosquito had a fighting chance, but it couldn't outrun a determined, well-positioned 109. Not without luck. He pushed the throttles forward. The boost needle climbed higher than any Mosquito pilot had seen. The Merlins responded instantly, their tone deepening into something primal. The aircraft surged. The airframe trembled slightly, but everything held. The Mosquito didn't just accelerate. It launched. The Bf 109 seconds tightened their turns, throttles wide open. German pilots radioed frantic updates. They expected the Mosquito to level out or climb. Instead, it slipped away faster, lower, and impossibly smooth. The intercept attempt collapsed in under a minute. When the pilot returned to base hours later, he climbed out of the cockpit with an excusing paw. Expression somewhere between disbelief and exhilaration. He didn't even remove his flight gloves before heading straight to the mechanic. "What did you do to her?" Word spread quickly. Crews began requesting the special tuning before missions. Each pilot returned with similar accounts: Bf 109 seconds, W 190 seconds, even early night fighters failing to close the gap. Luftwaffe reports started describing Mosquitoes achieving improbable speeds or accelerating in a manner inconsistent with known performance. In RAF intelligence rooms, officers raised eyebrows. Were the pilots exaggerating? Had someone filed incorrect performance data? Was it just good tailwinds? But it wasn't imagination. It wasn't luck. It was one mechanic's modifications mall invisible and quietly turning the Mosquito into the fastest operational aircraft in Europe. And across the front lines, the Luftwaffe was beginning to panic. The Luftwaffe had never liked the Mosquito. They respected it, feared it, cursed it, but they never understood it. A wooden plane that could outrun their best fighters? It didn't make sense. And now, in early 1944, something had changed again. Mosquitoes were being clocked at speeds no Allied intelligence report had ever mentioned. At night, fighter bases from Denmark to France, German pilots began filing bizarre combat debriefs. The Mosquito accelerated beyond visual range, unable to achieve closure. Target speed exceeded published data by large margin. At first, analysts blamed instrumentation errors. But as the reports piled up, panic crept into the discussion. Senior Luftwaffe officers started asking a question they had dreaded. Had the British developed a new Merlin engine? They studied gun camera footage. They combed through radio intercepts. They even examined wreckage from downed Mosquitoes, rare as it was. but every Merlin they inspected appeared normal. No bigger superchargers, no altered manifolds, no exotic fuel mixtures. Still, the mosquitoes were running, faster. The Luftwaffe's response was to throw faster aircraft into the hunt. They assigned Ju-88G one-night fighters with improved radar and more powerful engines. They redeployed units flying the Bf-110 heavily armed Zerstörer interceptors. They even began experimenting with the Me-262 jet as a potential mosquito hunter, though its early reliability issues made it a gamble. None of it seemed enough. During one night chase over northern Germany, a Ju-88G pilot watched in pure disbelief as his radar operator shouted that the Contactor Mosquito bomber was increasing speed. The German pilot pushed his throttles forward until the engines risked overspeed, but the British aircraft maintained its lead. In frustration, he radioed, "Target is too fast, impossible speed." Commanders refused to believe it. Engineers demanded answers. Intelligence officers sent reports upward warning that mosquitoes were operating at performance levels incompatible with known specifications. Some German analysts even speculated that the British were secretly running over-boosted Merlin's dangerous technique, but not impossible. Still, they couldn't prove it. There was no visible modification on the engines they recovered. Nothing in the captured manuals, no hint of an official RAF experiment. But deep in Allied territory, in a drafty hangar beside a dimly lit runway, the truth was simple. The RAF had no secret new engine model. They had one mechanic who refused to follow the rulebook. And the results were rippling across the skies of Europe, forcing German pilots to push their machines and themselves to breaking point just to match a wooden bomber that wasn't supposed to be this fast. It was inevitable. No rule-breaking survives long in wartime, especially when the results start drawing attention. By spring of 1944, squadron engineers were noticing something troubling. Certain mosquitoes specifically, the ones favored by a small group of aircrews, were coming back with more engine wear than usual. Spark plugs were running hotter, cylinder heads were discoloring faster, supercharger bearings showed unusual stress marks. None of it was catastrophic, but all of it suggested one thing. Someone was letting these Merlins run far beyond their approved boost limits. A senior engineering officer arrived unannounced for an inspection. He carried a clipboard thicker than a flight manual and a reputation for enforcing regulations down to the last washer and lock nut. Within hours, he identified a pattern engines, tuned by the same mechanic, were consistently producing more power than their paperwork allowed. That afternoon, the mechanic was summoned to a makeshift office beside the hangar. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The senior officer placed a small handful of components on the desk, the telltale parts of the supercharger linkage. Nothing obviously bent or damaged. But the tolerances were off, just enough to explain the mysterious performance. "What exactly," the officer asked coldly, "have you been doing to these engines?" There was no way to lie. The logs, the wear patterns, the performance reports, everything pointed straight to him. He admitted what he had done, though he avoided the details. The officer's face hardened. "You understand the seriousness of this. This is a direct violation of Merlin operating regulations. You endangered aircraft and crew. This modification is illegal." The mechanic braced for the worst demotion, grounding, reassignment, perhaps even accusations of sabotage. But before the officer could continue, voices erupted outside. Several pilots had shown up, demanding to be let in. They didn't care about protocol. They didn't care about rank. They cared about the man who had kept them alive. One pilot stepped forward and spoke plainly. "If you remove him, you'll be sending us into combat slower than we need to be. His engines get us home." Another added, "We've outrun fighters we had no business outrunning. That's because of him." The room fell silent. The senior officer leaned back, suddenly aware he wasn't dealing with a reckless tinkerer. He was dealing with someone the pilots trusted with their lives. Someone whose unauthorized modification was delivering undeniable results. Officially, the mechanic was reprimanded. A written warning, a stern lecture, threats of consequences if he ever repeated the behavior. Unofficially, the meeting ended with the officer quietly asking, Just how much extra boost can these Merlins really take? The mechanic didn't answer. He didn't need to. The RAF had a decision to make: ignore his findings or embrace them. And history shows what they chose. The RAF never issued a memo saying, "We're adopting an illegal engine trick." That's not how wartime decisions were made. Not when secrecy mattered, not when lives were on the line, and not when an enemy interceptor could appear at any altitude any moment. Instead, something subtle happened in mid-1944. Boost limits on certain Merlin variants were quietly raised. Fuel mixtures were revised. New guidelines allowed short bursts of higher manifold pressure when operationally necessary. On paper, these were routine updates. In reality, they were a cautious acknowledgement of what one mechanic had already proven in a dim hangar months earlier. The Merlin could take more. And the Mosquito would thrive on that extra power. Almost overnight, the aircraft reached new levels of performance. Pilots found their cruise speeds climbing. Their acceleration during evasive dives became ferocious. Their high-altitude runs over enemy territory, shortened by precious minutes that often meant the difference between survival and interception. By the summer raids of 1944, Mosquitoes were clocking over 400 miles per hour in level flight. Crews reported outrunning BF 109 seconds and FDU 190 seconds so efficiently that many German pilots simply abandoned intercept attempts once the chase passed a certain point. The Luftwaffe, increasingly desperate, deployed faster night fighters like the Ju-88 G6 and experimented with Me-262 jet intercepts. But even when the jet could catch a Mosquito in theory and practice, the British aircraft's agility and acceleration, especially with those over-boosted Merlins, made an interception window so narrow it bordered on impossible. German intelligence files began describing the Mosquito with a new nickname, Der Hölzerne Geist, the Wooden Ghost. It appeared on radar only briefly. It slipped through night skies almost unheard. It outran fighters that should have caught it, and when engineers examined recovered engines, they found nothing visibly suspicious, nothing that explained why these aircraft were suddenly flying like they had been reborn. Inside British bases, the pilots didn't talk much about the mechanic's trick anymore. It had become part of the machine, part of their confidence, part of the quiet advantage that only those who flew and maintained these aircraft truly understood. The mechanic still worked in the same hangar, still kept his head down, still followed regulations at least on the surface. But the RAF's new tolerance for higher boost settings meant he no longer had to bend the rules to give pilots the performance they needed. His work, once forbidden, had become part of the Mosquito's legacy. By late 1944, the aircraft wasn't just the fastest bomber in the war, it was one of the fastest operational aircraft of any kind. A wooden machine powered by engines running just beyond the boundaries of their manuals, outpacing an enemy that once believed speed belonged solely to the German fighter arm. All because one mechanic refused to accept that good enough was truly enough. War is often measured by grand battles and heroic leaders. But sometimes its course is quietly shaped by the small, unseen acts of individuals, the ones who dare to challenge the rules in pursuit of something greater. This mechanic never sought fame. His name is buried deep in the archives, lost amid thousands of others who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Yet his illegal boost trick changed the Mosquito's fate and, with it, the fate of countless crews who flew into the night, knowing their chances improved with every extra mile per hour. The Mosquito became a legend not because of its wood or guns, but because of its speed. Speed born not just from engineering manuals, but from courage to push beyond them. In a war defined by technology and tactics, sometimes the sharpest edge was not forged in factories or labs, but in the mind and hands of a single mechanic willing to break the rules to save lives. When we look back on the wooden ghost that haunted German skies, we should remember the quiet rebellion that powered it, the hidden boost that turned a bomber into a ghostly arrow no fighter could catch. Sometimes the smallest sparks create the brightest flames.